JSON. Love it or hate it, it is the way that we access data on the web the majority of the time. Almost every API returns JSON responses, and if it doesn't, it returns something that looks a lot like it. I'm here to argue that JSON might not always be the right solution, specifically for sending data to users, and I want to draw this distinction now. There are plenty of solutions to server-to-server communications that I'm not here to talk about, like protobuf or crazy namespace sharing things like Elixir and Erlang. What I'm here to focus on is the new solutions that recognize JSON might not be the best way for a server and a client to interact. Turns out, way back in the history of the web, we didn't even have JSON. So when a server wanted to send something to the user, what would it send? It's kind of obvious. HTML. Turns out HTML is a really good standard for taking information that a server has and presenting it to a user. And as great as JSON is, it has started to replace HTML in a lot of places. I am certainly not one to crap on React, but I do have to blame them a bit here. The single page app model was so compelling that we kind of stopped sending HTML from our servers for a long time. Over the last few years, we've seen many large projects send tiny HTML files with a link to a JavaScript tag that then downloads a bunch of JS, but then runs and downloads a bunch of API calls with JSON to then render your UI. And I think that's okay for a lot of stuff, but I don't think it makes sense as the default. JSON is a standard with lots of flaws and problems. We could go in forever on how weird the different encoding and decoding behaviors are across languages and versions of things. JSON 5 fixes a lot of problems, but also isn't supported by very much stuff. We don't even have trailing commas or proper undefined support. It's a bit of a mess. If you never had a weird problem with JSON behaving unexpectedly, I envy you, because I have them multiple times a week at this point, and I have for years now. JSON isn't the right solution when you're trying to render UI a lot of the time. And it's nice to see a trend away from sending JSON down the wire towards things that make more sense for the browser. And that's what I'm seeing now on two ends in particular. The first one I want to talk about is HTMX. Yes, I know y'all didn't seem to think I would like HTMX, but I genuinely really do. The beauty of HTMX is that we're no longer building an API separate from a client and then having to build this strong relationship between the two with APIs and schemas and possibly even type definitions and behaviors to allow the client to get the right update from the server. Instead, the server just sends the right HTML. And when something changes, the server sends updated HTML for the client to render in that spot. It might sound crazy to do that. Like, isn't the HTML payload going to be way bigger than the JSON? Well, usually not, because people overfetch like mad with JSON. And if you're fetching a user object just to render their name in a div, you're fetching a lot of JSON versus just a tiny bit of HTML. And when you send the correct HTML down the wire, you're effectively guaranteeing that the smallest possible representation of what the user will see is what's being sent down. And more often than not, that ends up being the smallest thing you can send. This took me a while to accept. It just felt so inefficient. When I have this data and the client has to render it, why not send the data to the client and let the client render it? We're sending all this compute off our servers. We're going to save so much money just letting the client's device do the work. Turns out serializing that stuff in an HTML template is like a millisecond or two of work, even in heavier solutions. So it doesn't make that much sense, especially since we have to send every possible representation of the HTML to the client in the form of JavaScript. When you're using React, you might not have to render HTML that isn't being used yet, and you won't render it until the right JSON is sent telling you what to render, but you have to send every possible permutation of that render in the JavaScript blob that is being used. This does not work for a lot of things. Obviously, on the web, this isn't great because you have to send so much JavaScript to the user for all your different possibilities. This works even worse on platforms like mobile. Let's say I'm Facebook and I have my newsfeed and we want to introduce a new type of post to the newsfeed. If that post type isn't included in the binary for Android and iOS, and I post something with that new shape, those platforms don't know how to render it. So they have to come up with some other solution, like don't render it, fall back to a web embedder, do some weird stuff. And you will never guarantee all of your users are on the latest version, especially on mobile, because people don't update their apps. And a large portion of your users might be on versions of your app that are years old. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we need to stop just sending data to the client, expecting it to render it correctly. The more we structure how things should be rendered on the server and then send the thing to render to the client, the less we'll run into these types of problems and the simpler our tech often ends up being. This is the model Facebook uses for a lot of stuff. This is the model that Google uses for YouTube. This is the model many big platforms use, where they define not just the data shape, but the UI behavior on the server and then send that to the client instead. This is the mindset that inspired React server components, which are the other solution I want to talk about here. The beauty of server components is you no longer have to define an API to get data to your client. Your client doesn't have to fetch things in JavaScript land. It can be sent a serialized HTML stream from the server to fill in different components and the markup they should be rendering. The client no longer needs to know about the structure of this data. It just needs to know what to render and where. And the server can tell it very simply. This model is huge. And the beauty of both server components and HTMX is they help you continue updating the HTML and having a markup-based standard instead of a database standard as the language between the server and the client. When you click a button, you can send back HTML to update the state of the page instead of sending down JSON that tells the page, hey, this is the new state, re-render the whole page with new content. By the way, make sure all of that content is in your JavaScript bundle. Otherwise, you're gonna have to fetch another bundle before you can even start the load. It's chaos. And I'm really excited to see so many solutions recognizing that, hey, maybe JSON was the wrong primitive for these things. Maybe JSON isn't the ideal way for us to update our clients when things change on the server. Maybe HTML was the right solution this whole time. And that's why I'm excited about the future of post-JSON solutions. It's not really post-JSON, it's post-APIs and post-building a wall between the server and the client. The more walls you build, the harder it becomes to build around them. And when we remove JSON, we're often just removing a wall that didn't need to be there in the first place. And don't get me started on GraphQL. Thank you all very much for sticking by for this one. Let me know what your thoughts are. Are you pro or anti-JSON? And are you, more importantly, pro or anti-API when HTML could do the same thing? I am definitely on the API side of things here, and that's why I'm a huge Astro fan as well. Speaking of Astro, they just put out a huge release, and I'll pin the video all about that in the corner if you're curious. Maybe I'll even put the HTMX video on the bottom here too if you want to watch that instead. Thank you guys as always. Really appreciate y'all. Peace, nerds.